The river was quiet that morning, in the way that felt earned rather than empty, the kind of quiet that settles after weeks of the same routine, when the body moves through familiar motions and the mind drifts somewhere just behind the eyes, watching without expecting anything in particular to change. The Luangwa ran copper and slow, the way it always did deep in the dry season, its banks pulled back to reveal long, pale shelves of cracked mud where the waterline had stood months before. The earth there was the color of old bone, split into irregular tiles by the heat, and along the edges where the mud met the water, the tracks of animals who had come to drink in the early hours were still sharp and readable: elephant, buffalo, the small, neat impressions of a jackal moving along the margin just before dawn. 4 men moved through the middle channel in a patrol boat, the small outboard motor turning at low throttle, barely disturbing the surface. They had been on the water for just over 40 minutes and had seen nothing that required documentation. A handful of egrets arranged on a sandbar like white punctuation marks, a large Nile crocodile hauled up on a distant bank with its jaw open to the morning air, the ordinary and unhurried arrangements of a river that asked nothing from the people passing through it. The patrol was routine in the fullest sense of the word. There was paperwork waiting back at camp. There was a resupply vehicle expected sometime before midday. The morning had the feel of something that would pass without incident and be recorded as such. Daka sat at the stern with one hand resting on the motor, and his gaze moving in the slow, practiced arc of someone who had learned to look without staring, to take in the full width of a scene rather than fixing on any one part of it. 15 years on this river had given him a particular quality of attention, not hypervigilant, not relaxed, but calibrated somewhere between the two, a quiet readiness that registered details before the conscious mind had named them. He had grown up further north, near the escarpment, and had come to the Luangwa as a young man who understood the bush in a general way but had needed years to understand this river, specifically its moods, its particular animal populations, the way its surface could look the same from one week to the next, while everything beneath it shifted continuously. The ecologist, seated just forward of him, had his notebook open across his knees and was writing in the small, unhurried hand of someone accustomed to recording things that moved slowly. He was documenting a sighting from 20 minutes back, a family group of puku on the western bank, a count and behavioral note. The 2 younger rangers sat at the bow, talking to each other in voices too low to carry above the motor, their eyes moving over the water with the competent but not yet deeply experienced attention of men still building the knowledge that would eventually become instinct. It was the ecologist who stopped first. He didn't speak. He simply stopped writing, and his pen stilled on the page, and he looked upstream with the particular quality of attention that isn't looking for something, but has already found it and is trying to understand what it is. 50 meters ahead of the boat, something large was moving through the water toward them. It was not drifting. It was not surfacing in the loose, unhurried rhythm a hippo used when a passing boat had come too close and it chose simply to relocate downstream. This animal was swimming with direction, a steady, purposeful displacement of copper water, the kind of movement that had a destination behind it, an intention, and the destination appeared to be the boat itself. Daka eased the throttle back without being asked. The motor dropped to an idle. The 2 younger rangers stopped their conversation. The hippo was a mature female. She was broad-backed and very dark, her skin the deep gray-brown of riverstone that has been wet for decades, and her nostrils and the upper ridge of her head held just above the waterline as she swam. No calf moved beside her. No other animals surfaced in her vicinity. The rest of her pod was visible further upriver, a loose cluster of rounded shapes resting in the shallows against the far bank, their bodies half submerged, indifferent to whatever this one was doing on the other side of the channel. She had left them and crossed the open water alone, and she was still coming, and she had not changed course. Every ranger on the Luangwa learned early, and learned clearly, that distance was the arrangement that kept things civil. Hippos were not slow, not passive, not the lumbering animals that people who had never seen them move assumed them to be. In shallow water they were shockingly fast. They were territorial and capable of overturning a vessel with a speed that left no time for response. The standing protocol was unambiguous. Observe from a respectful distance. Do not approach. Withdraw at the first sign of aggression or directed movement. Daka had enforced that protocol on other rangers more times than he could easily count, and he believed in it the way you believe in something that has kept people safe. He did not reach for the throttle to reverse. He would not be able to explain this fully afterward, not in the way that satisfied people who wanted a procedural justification. What he would say, when asked, was that he had been on the river long enough to know the difference between an animal moving towards something it intended to harm and an animal moving towards something it needed. He could not have defined that difference in measurable terms. He knew it the way you know certain things only after years of paying close attention, not as a rule, but as a feeling that had been tested enough times to be trusted. She slowed as she reached the radius of the boat's presence. She did not stop far off. She came close enough that the boat's small wake had already disturbed the water around her, close enough that the men could make out the pale, healed ridges of old scars along her flank, where some previous conflict had left its record on her skin. She settled at the surface just short of the hull, her mass barely moving in the water, and her eyes dark, still, rimmed with the rough texture of a hide that had lived entirely outdoors, rose clear of the surface and came to rest on the boat. Not on the motor, not on the bow, on the men themselves. Daka sat with both hands open on his knees. The ecologist had closed his notebook. Nobody reached for anything, and nobody suggested doing so. The river moved past them, unhurried, indifferent. Somewhere along the far bank, a hammerkop worked the shallows without looking up. The morning held its temperature and its color, and continued in all the ordinary ways that mornings did. But the four men in that boat were no longer inside an ordinary morning. They were inside something they didn't yet have a name for, held at the surface of the water by an animal that had come to them deliberately and now simply waited, with a patience that felt enormous, for something she seemed to believe they were capable of understanding. For a long moment, nothing moved. The hippo held her position at the surface with the kind of stillness that large animals achieve when they have made a decision and are waiting for the world to respond to it. The water around her barely shifted. Her breathing was audible from where the men sat, a slow, measured passage of air through nostrils that opened and closed with each cycle, the sound of a body working to stay calm, or perhaps of a body that had moved beyond the point where calm required effort and had arrived somewhere further along, somewhere that looked like stillness but was something else entirely. The men did not speak. The motor was silent. The current moved past the hull in a quiet, continuous murmur that was the only sound the river offered. Daka had seen hippos at close range more times than he could number. He had been on the water during territorial displays, had witnessed the jaw-gaping aggression that bulls directed at rival males, and at any vessel that entered their established range, had once reversed a boat at speed while a large male pursued them for nearly 80 meters through a narrow channel. He knew the physical vocabulary of hippo aggression the way a person learns a language they depend on for survival fluently, below the level of conscious translation. And what he was looking at now was not that vocabulary. None of the words were the same. Her jaw was closed. Her ears were still, not rotating in the rapid, anxious way that indicated a heightened threat response. She had not exhaled through her nostrils in the sharp, percussive blast that hippos used as a warning. She had not dipped below the surface to prepare for a submerged approach. She was simply there, at the side of the boat, occupying the water with her full, enormous weight, and looking at them with an attention so steady and sustained that it was almost uncomfortable to meet. The ecologist sat with his pen resting across his closed notebook and watched her with the careful, neutral observation of someone trained to record what was actually present rather than what they expected to find. He noted, in the part of his mind that never fully stopped cataloging, that her eyes held no white, no scleral exposure, which in hippos was a recognized indicator of extreme stress or imminent aggression. Her eyes were dark, and they were focused, and they were staying that way. What they were not was indifferent. The younger ranger on the port side shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, a small, involuntary adjustment against the discomfort of proximity, and the ecologist put a hand on his arm without looking at him. The gesture said everything the situation required. Stay still, stay slow, do not introduce anything new into this moment. Then she made the sound. It came from somewhere deep in the chest, not from the throat in the way of a surface vocalization, but from further down, from a place in the body where sound becomes more vibration than noise, where it moves through tissue and water before it reaches the air. It was low, and it was resonant, and it lasted perhaps 4 seconds before it faded, and in the silence after it the river felt changed, as though the sound had altered something in the air, the way a stone alters the surface it is dropped into, in rings that spread further than the eye can follow. None of the 4 men had heard a hippo make that sound before. Daka knew hippo vocalizations. He knew the wheel call they used between group members, the honking contact calls, the grunts and bellows of territorial communication. What he had just heard did not fit any of those categories. It was not an alarm call. It was not an aggressive vocalization. It was something lower and less structured, something that carried in it a quality he could not name precisely, but that landed in him the way distress signals land. Not as information, exactly, but as weight. She made it again. He leaned forward then, slowly, shifting his center of gravity toward the edge of the boat without standing, without making any sudden change in his profile. He was looking at the water behind her. He had been looking at her face and her body, reading her the way the situation demanded, but now something in the sound, in the combination of that sound and the steadiness of her attention, moved his gaze past her to the river she had come from. The water behind her looked undisturbed, copper-colored and slow and empty of anything that immediately clarified what he was looking for. He scanned across it in the methodical way, near to far, left to right, that years of fieldwork had made automatic. The light was still angled low enough to create glare in places, and the natural turbidity of the dry-season river swallowed detail below the first meter of depth. He almost moved his gaze back, then he held it. 3 meters behind her, perhaps slightly to the right, something broke the surface in a rhythm that was just slightly wrong, just barely irregular. A small disturbance, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that would register from any distance, but from here, in the boat, with the motor off and the water quiet and his attention already sharpened by everything that had happened in the last several minutes, it was enough. He looked at the ecologist. The ecologist was already looking at the same spot. "Do you see it?" Daka said. It was not a question. The ecologist nodded once, slowly, his eyes still on the water. What they could see from the boat was not yet clear enough to define fully. A shape, small and rounded, at the surface. A hint of movement below it that was not consistent with the current. But there was something else, something that caught the light in a way the water itself did not. A faint geometric quality to what surrounded the small shape, thin lines at irregular angles, the kind of pattern that did not occur naturally in a river. The kind of pattern that was made by human hands and left behind without intention. The mother had not moved from the side of the boat. She remained exactly where she had positioned herself, and her eyes had not left the men, and the sound she had made twice now sat in the air around all of them like something that was still waiting to be answered. The river moved past them without urgency. A fish broke the surface 20 meters downstream and was gone. The morning continued, bright and ordinary in all the ways that did not matter, while the 4 men in the patrol boat sat at the edge of understanding something that had not yet fully arrived, something that was taking shape just beneath the water behind a mother who had crossed an open river to find them and who had not turned away. The ecologist moved first, and he moved slowly. He closed his notebook and set it on the floor of the boat without looking down, keeping his eyes on the water behind the mother as he shifted his weight forward onto his knees. It was a deliberate choice, kneeling rather than leaning, lowering his profile rather than extending it, reducing the visual mass he presented to an animal who was already managing more than any wild creature should be asked to manage at once. The boat rocked almost imperceptibly with the redistribution of his weight. The mother's ears rotated forward, registering the movement, and her body stiffened for a fraction of a second before it settled again. She did not retreat. She did not advance. She held the space she had claimed beside the hull, and kept her eyes moving between the men and the water behind her with a rhythm that was beginning to feel less like vigilance and more like instruction. From the kneeling position, leaning over the port side with his face closer to the surface, the ecologist could see more than he had been able to from his seat. The light was better at this angle, less glare, more penetration into the upper layer of the river, and what had been an indistinct shape and a vague geometric irregularity resolved, slowly, into something he could understand. The calf was very small. It was positioned just below the surface, its body oriented roughly parallel to the current, and it was alive. That was the first thing, the thing his mind established before anything else, because the alternative had been sitting at the edge of his awareness since the moment Daka had said what he said and the ecologist had looked and seen the shape. It was alive, and it was breathing, its small nostrils breaking the surface in a rhythm that was too effortful, too deliberate, the breathing of an animal working harder than it should have to work for something that should have been automatic. Around its body, the line was visible. It was monofilament, primarily heavy gauge, the kind used in illegal gill nets set across the shallower bends of the river where seasonal fish migrations made the catching easy, and the risk of being discovered, in the minds of those who set such things, worth taking. The line had accumulated on itself in the way that drifting, untethered things do in moving water, gathering into a loose, tangled mass that had found the calf the way the river found everything, eventually without intent, without cruelty, simply by being the medium through which things moved and collected and sometimes caught. It was wrapped across the calf's midsection, tighter on the right side than the left, and a separate length had looped around its left hind leg and pulled into a configuration that prevented the normal cycling movement of the limb. A small constellation of other debris had collected in the line's folds, a scrap of darker material, some river weed, a few pieces of what might once have been afloat. The ecologist sat back on his heels and looked at Daka. What passed between them in that look was not a conversation. It was faster than that and quieter, the compression of a shared assessment into a single exchange that both men understood completely. The situation, its difficulty, its risk, and the direction they were going to take anyway. All of it covered in a glance that lasted perhaps 2 seconds before Daka was already reaching for the equipment case bolted to the stern. The mother had not moved from the side of the boat. This was the thing that kept returning to the ecologist as he turned to watch her while Daka worked behind him, the fact of her continued presence, her sustained proximity to these men in this vessel, which by every framework of wild animal behavior should have been the thing she moved away from, especially with a vulnerable calf nearby. Hippo mothers were extraordinarily protective. The literature was unambiguous on this. Documented accounts of maternal aggression in hippos involved vehicles, boats, other animals, and humans on foot, any of whom had come too close to a calf. The instinct was not subtle and it was not negotiable, and yet she was here. 3 meters from 4 men in a boat, making no aggressive movement, watching them with eyes that held something dense and unreadable but not hostile. The junior ranger, Sebeso, had not spoken since the motor went off. He sat at the bow with his hands in his lap, and his eyes moving between the mother and the water where the calf lay, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone who has just revised, without choosing to, something fundamental about the way they understood the world. He was 23. He had grown up knowing that wild animals and humans occupied different territories separated by a distance that was respected from both sides. He had taken this position understanding that. What he was sitting inside right now did not fit that understanding, and he was not yet sure what to replace it with, so he simply sat with it and watched. Daka brought the cutting tool and the dive knife forward and handed the cutting tool to the ecologist. They had both used it before on entangled animals, once on a young crocodile tangled in the same type of illegal net material, once on a sitatunga that had gotten wire wrapped around its foreleg near the park's northern boundary. The tool itself was designed for this kind of work, a compact, hook-bladed cutter that could get between a line and skin without the leverage problems of a straight blade, without requiring the kind of force that risked injury to an animal already compromised. The mother made the sound again, low, resonant, moving through the water before it moved through the air. "Easy," Daka said, not loudly. It was addressed to no one in particular, or perhaps to everything: the moment, the animal, the men, the river. A word placed into the situation, like a hand placed gently on something that needed steadying. The ecologist leaned back over the side, tool in hand, and looked at the calf again. It had turned its head slightly toward the boat, dark eyes open, their surface catching the light in a dull, exhausted way. It did not thrash. It did not attempt to dive, whether from depletion or from the proximity of its mother, or from some biological response to a threat too large and confusing to process. It held still in the water with a kind of terrible patience that made the ecologist move with corresponding care. The first thing was to get close enough without destabilizing the boat. The second was to work the blade into the right position before the calf reacted. The third, the largest and least controllable variable, was the mother, who had given every indication that she understood something about what was happening, but who was still a wild animal, still enormous, still capable of ending this in a way that nobody could recover from. The ecologist took one slow breath and reached into the water. The line was tighter than it looked. The river moved around his arm, cool and constant. Behind him, the boat was silent. Beside the hull, the mother held her position and watched, and her breathing was the only sound that existed in the world for those few seconds, steady and present and waiting. The first cut took longer than expected. The monofilament was old and had been in the water long enough to stiffen into something that resisted the blade at the first angle the ecologist tried. He adjusted his grip on the cutting tool, repositioned the hook behind the thickest section of the line where it crossed the calf's right side, and applied pressure slowly, not forcing it, letting the blade find the give in the material rather than demanding it. The calf moved once, a small lateral shift of its hindquarters, and the ecologist paused completely, his hand still in the water, his arm resting against the hull without weight. He waited until the calf stilled again before he continued. Behind him, nobody spoke. Daka had positioned himself at the center of the boat, equidistant from the bow and stern, which was partly about weight distribution and partly about angle. From where he sat, he could watch both the ecologist's hands in the water and the mother at the port side simultaneously, managing the full picture of what was happening in a way that allowed him to respond in any direction without delay. It was the kind of positioning that happened automatically after enough years in the field, the body arranging itself according to variables the conscious mind was still cataloging. He watched the mother with the focused, quiet attention he would have given any animal in a situation this compressed. She had not moved. This was the fact that everything else in the next several minutes would depend on, and it was a fact that remained astonishing each time Daka returned his gaze to confirm it. She was holding her position at the surface beside the hull, not frozen in the rigid way of an animal suppressing a fear response at its limit, but settled, her body loose enough in the water that the current moved gently around her flanks, her breathing continuing at a rate that was elevated but not panicked. Her eyes moved. That was the only part of her that did a slow, continuous tracking between the ecologist's movements at the waterline and the place where her calf floated, back and forth, with a regularity that felt almost like a form of counting, like an animal keeping two things in frame at once because losing either of them was not acceptable. The first line came free. The ecologist felt it release under the blade and drew the cut section out of the water carefully, passing it back to Sebeso without looking, who took it and coiled it into the bottom of the boat with hands that were not entirely steady. The calf's breathing changed almost immediately, a single deeper inflation of its small barrel chest, the body registering the reduced compression before the mind could process anything. It was involuntary and immediate, the biology responding to relief before the animal itself had any framework for what had just changed. The mother made a sound, not the deep resonant vocalization from before, but something shorter and quieter, a single low note that lasted less than 2 seconds and then was gone. It was not a warning, it was not distress. It was something that existed in a register the men could hear, but not fully interpret, the way you can hear music through a wall and understand its mood without making out its structure. The second line was looser and came away faster, 40 seconds of careful work, the blade finding its position more easily now that the ecologist had the measure of the material. The debris that had collected in the folds came with it, the scrap of dark material and the river weed and the remnants of what had once been a net float, the accumulated evidence of something left in the water without thought for what it would eventually find. The ecologist set all of it in the boat beside the first cut section and turned his attention to the third length, the one around the calf's left hind leg, the one that had altered the animal's ability to move with the asymmetrical pull it had been exerting across its developing joints for what the ecologist estimated, based on the degree of entanglement and the calf's apparent age, had been somewhere between 4 and 7 days. This one was different. It had worked itself into a configuration where the line had doubled back on itself under the leg, creating a loop that tightened, when pulled from the outside, and would require a different approach, not pulling but lifting, getting the blade underneath from below rather than cutting from above. The ecologist studied it for a moment with his hand resting in the water beside it, not touching yet, reading the geometry before committing to a direction. Sebeso moved forward from the bow without being asked, settling beside the ecologist and gripping the back of his vest and anchor, keeping the ecologist's weight stable as he reached further over the side to get the blade into the correct position beneath the loop. The boat adjusted to the shift in weight. The mother's ears rotated toward the movement, and her body tensed a visible, full-body contraction that lasted perhaps 3 seconds before it eased. She did not move from her position. The ecologist got the blade underneath the doubled line. He worked it with a patience that cost him something. His arm was submerged to the elbow. The angle was awkward, and the calf's leg was moving in small, reflexive cycles that required him to pause twice and wait for a stillness that was long enough to work safely. The third pause lasted nearly 20 seconds. He held the tool in place and did not rush it. "You're all right," he said, barely above a breath. Not to the calf, not to the mother, not to anyone in particular. The words released into the air above the water, the way an exhale releases not a statement, not a command, just the sound of a person remaining present inside something very difficult. The line gave way. It came free in a single, clean release, the loop collapsing away from the leg, and the ecologist drew the blade back and straightened slowly, pulling the last section of line out of the water and sitting back from the edge of the boat with the care of someone who understood that the moment wasn't over simply because the work was done. He looked at the calf. Its left hind leg moved, freely, fully, cycling through the water with the unobstructed ease of a limb restored to itself. The calf's body rose slightly in the water, a natural adjustment, buoyancy correcting for the absence of the weight and drag that had been altering it for days. It turned its head toward its mother with the blind, instinctive orientation of a young animal toward the presence it had known longer than anything else. The mother moved then, slowly, with enormous care. She crossed the small distance between herself and her calf and lowered her great head until it rested, gently, against the calf's side. She held it there. The calf did not pull away. The river ran quietly around both of them, carrying the morning forward without ceremony. Daka sat with his hands open on his knees and did not look away. In 15 years on the Luangwa, he had seen many things that stayed with him. He understood, sitting in that boat with the cut lines coiled in the hull and the water still cool on the ecologist's arm, that this was going to be one of them, not for its drama, but for the precise quality of what the mother had done and what she had asked of them, and the fact that the river had made a space for all of it to happen exactly as it needed to. They stayed where they were for a while. Nobody suggested moving. Nobody reached for the motor or picked up a paddle or began the small administrative gestures that typically mark the end of a field event, the opening of notebooks, the checking of radios, the quiet resumption of procedure. The boat sat in the middle of the channel and the river moved around it, and the 4 men inside it remained exactly as the last several minutes had left them, each one held in place by something that had not yet finished its work on them. The mother had not submerged immediately. After the long moment with her head resting against her calf's side, she had lifted it slowly and moved to position herself alongside the smaller animal, her body a wall between the calf and the current, guiding without forcing the way hippo mothers moved their young in open water, using mass and presence rather than direct contact, creating a channel of safety that the calf simply occupied. The calf had moved with her. Its legs cycled properly now, both hind limbs working in the synchronized rhythm that restored its balance in the water, and the difference was visible even to eyes that had only known the calf in its compromised state. It moved differently. It held the surface differently. The effort was gone from its breathing, replaced by the easy, reflexive inflation of lungs that were no longer working against a constriction. They had watched this together, the 4 men, without speaking. Then the mother had turned toward the deeper channel, and the calf had followed, and both of them had descended with a slowness that seemed almost considered a gradual lowering, the river accepting them back the way it accepted everything, without ceremony, the surface closing above them in widening rings that flattened and then disappeared. And then there was only the water, copper-colored and moving, the same as it had been at the start of the morning. Daka was the first to move, and what he did was reach into the hull of the boat and pick up the coiled sections of cut line. He held them in both hands for a moment, looking at them, at the stiffened monofilament, the knotted mass of it, the accumulated debris still caught in its folds. It was a small and ugly thing to have caused what it had caused. He placed it into the evidence bag that the ecologist held open without either of them saying anything, and the ecologist sealed it and wrote the date and location on the label in the small, careful hand he used for things that needed to be recorded accurately. The documentation would go into the park's illegal fishing activity report. It would be cross-referenced with previous net seizures in this section of the channel. It would contribute, in the aggregate way that field data contributed, to the ongoing effort to reduce the presence of unattended gill nets in the river system. All of that was real and necessary, and would happen in the ordinary course of the work they did. But sitting in the boat with the sealed evidence bag between them, neither man was inside the documentation. They were inside something that the documentation would never fully contain. Sebeso had not spoken since the single, quiet sentence the ecologist had released over the water during the cutting of the last line. He sat at the bow facing upstream, toward the place where the mother and calf had been, toward the part of the river that looked now exactly as it had looked when they first came through it an hour ago. He was trying to locate, in everything he understood about wild animals and the distance between their world and the human one, a framework that accommodated what he had just been part of. He was 23, and the Luangwa was still teaching him things faster than he could process them, and this morning it had taught him something he suspected would take years to fully understand, if understanding was even the right word for what eventually happened to an experience like this one. Daka started the motor after a time, not because urgency had returned, but because the river patrol had a course and a purpose, and those things did not pause for the moments the river occasionally gave back. The outboard turned over quietly and settled into its low working note, and the boat began moving again downstream, retracing the channel they had come through at the start of the shift. The water was the same water, the banks were the same banks. The egrets on the sandbar were still there, or had returned, white and patient in the shallowing light of mid-morning. The ecologist opened his notebook. He sat for a long time with his pen above the page before he began to write. What he eventually recorded was precise and professional time, location, species, entanglement material, approximate calf age, intervention method, outcome. He wrote it in the language that field notes required, which was the language of observation stripped of interpretation, of data that could be read by someone who had not been there and still carry meaning. He was good at this. He had been doing it for many years, and he trusted the process of it, the way it made the formless into something that could be held and passed forward. But he knew, writing it, that the notes would not carry the sound she had made. They would not carry the way she had held position beside the hull, the particular quality of her stillness, the thing that had existed in her attention that none of the standard behavioral categories quite fit. Those things would travel a different way, not in reports, but in the way certain experiences traveled, through the people who had been inside them, surfacing in conversation years later or in the middle of an ordinary day, arriving without announcement the way rivers arrive at the sea, having come a very long way through terrain that changed them and was changed by them. The afternoon came on slowly as they finished the patrol route and turned back toward the ranger station. The light shifted from its midday whiteness into the longer, warmer angles of late afternoon, and the river changed color under it from copper to something richer, a deep amber that held the sun the way old glass holds it, with a kind of interior warmth. Along the western bank, a small group of impala had come down to drink, standing in a careful line at the water's edge, their legs elegant and precise on the pale mud. Above the tree line, two yellow-billed storks rode a thermal in slow, tilting circles, rising without effort on the warm air. Sebeso watched the river from the bow as the station came into view ahead. He would tell this story many times over the coming years to other rangers, to visiting researchers, to his family when he went home to the escarpment at the end of the dry season. Each time he told it, he would find that the part that was hardest to convey was not the danger of it, or the strangeness, but the quietness. The way the whole thing had happened in a hush, with the river moving and the motor off, and four men sitting still while a mother waited beside them and trusted them with the most important thing she had. The boat reached the bank and the motor went off and the morning's work was done. Somewhere downstream, in the deep, slow channel where the river widened and the water ran coolest, A mother hippo moved through the dark with her calf close at her flank, both of them unhurried, both of them whole, the river carrying them forward the way it carried everything gently, and without asking anything in return.